Hi, my job today is to talk for about 5 minutes on remains and some of the key ideas and topics of this poem that will enable you to get a good position for your revision. So, firstly, key ideas for context. This is from a collection called The Not Dead, and I think that's really key because there's that idea of these are the people who survived, these people who came home, but were damaged, broken, injured. The same person who went out didn't come back, I think, is kind of the big idea, because Armitage was really interested in looking at the idea of the impact on mental health and things like PTSD. And so they're not dead, but equally the people they were to begin with kind of are. And there's this sense that they're not really alive either. They're sort of in this twilight, haunted place. So I think that that's a really interesting idea. I think it's really important to remember that this is not autobiographical, but aims to tell authentic stories for those who did experience these things. So Armitage is trying to give his skills and expertise as a writer to help people who had lived through these traumatic experiences, to give them the opportunity to tell their story effectively and get that out there to the people. So it's really important to remember he was inspired by these soldier poets such as Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, who were revolutionary in helping to bring the truth of the horrors of the trenches in World War One to the people at home, and began this really big transformation of how the general public perceive warfare and the reality of war. And Armitage was quite aware that that was a tradition that was getting lost and was something he wanted to try and help with, even though he's not a soldier himself. And really important to remember that this is actually a poem about the long-term impacts of conflict, particularly the impact on mental health. So it provides quite a nice contrast to Bayonet Charge or Exposure, which focus very much on the time and the place. And here it's thinking about the much longer experiences and the really damaging long-term effects. So the key methods in this poem, you have this colloquial voice. The voice for me in Remains is all important. It has that sense of authenticity. It begins in the sense that on another occasion, as if you're in the middle of a conversation. You get those horrific contrasts of phrases where you've got, like tossed his guts and stuff like that, which gives this real matter-of-factness and that sense of truth and authenticity to the story that's being told. The enjambment in this poem is really powerful, particularly across stanzas, where you get, combined with the voice, you get this sense of someone who is steeling themselves for the next bit. And I think it's always really interesting to look at the phrase directly before the enjambment across the stanzas, where there's a little pause enforced. So why are we focusing on that phrase? And then what are we being set up for or prepared for? And how does that affect how the next phrase or line lands with us as we move on across the enjambment? You've got that very brutal imagery that's being used in this poem. Rips through his life is one of those big phrases I really like from a metaphorical standpoint, to give us that sense of just how horrifying these experiences are, but equally the sense of matter-of-factness that comes with them. And you get that again where he's talking about blinking, dreaming, sleeping, and the images that crop up, and that sense that he feels almost under physical attack. To a certain extent. And as I've said, that metaphorical language that's being used, things like rips through his life, are really, really key, and always coupled with that probably armed, possibly not. So I love this poem. I think it's one of the best ones out there in this. I think that sense of authenticity is really powerful for the reader. I really feel for the voice of this poem. I feel desperately sad and sorry for him by the end of it and the situation he was in. And that sense of pathos that's created, so that real sense of pity for the speaker. And I think what's really interesting in this poem is that sense of the powerless trying to reclaim some power. So as opposed to like My Last Duchess, where we never hear from or see anything of her, she is utterly powerless. You get that sense of a man who's been broken, and a lot of his anger comes from the fact that he can't mend it and he can't fix it. He was a strong, brave soldier who has been totally broken by his experience of conflict. And I think that sense of powerlessness from someone who has been powerful is quite an interesting scenario that's been created there. So when you're thinking about making links to different poems, I think this is a really versatile poem, one that you can use in a lot of different ways. So I'd think about the way that power and powerlessness is presented. So you've got things like in London, the hapless soldier's sighs and the blood runs down palace walls. You've got, for me, Checking Out the History is a really good comparative poem for this one. Something like Poppies, where you've got the other perspective of someone who's powerless as a consequence of conflict. You've got the reality of conflict in here, some real brutal imagery, so that works really nicely with something like not Remains, because Remains is what we talked about, something like Exposure or Bayonet Charge, where you see the sort of horrifying reality, or again Poppies, where we see the reality of conflict from a different perspective. You've got the violence in here, so that works beautifully. You've got that would link very nicely to something like Charge of the Light Brigade, which works very nicely, or perhaps Kamikaze to a certain extent, where you get that very peaceful imagery while he's ostensibly on this very violent endeavour, and it's that the peaceful imagery that sort of brings him home. And that sense of a personal experience. So even though Armitage didn't write this, it is based on a personal experience, and it has that sense of the personal coming through. So you could link it to something like The Prelude even, or again, London I think works very nicely, Checking Out the History. For me, those two make a really excellent coupling.